This video is supposed to be about postpartum meal prep and just a sneak peek into some of my Azure standard staples. But life doesn't always go that way. So at least here I got a video in of these banana nut energy balls. I got this particular recipe from Downshiftology. If you've never heard of her, she has a lot of YouTube content, also a website, and a lot of really helpful, healthy recipes. So I definitely recommend her content, and these ended up being really good. So energy balls are definitely a go-to for me. Postpartum, it's just something I can keep in the freezer and eat, 2 or 3 of them if I'm gonna breastfeed or like in the middle of the night if I'm up with the baby. And it's just really helpful because it fills me up and gives me actual like supportive energy. So that's what I love about those. So I had many other recipes planned to film, and I'll kind of give a list of those at the end, but they did not get made because unfortunately, 3 days after these videos were filmed, I got the news that my Abba, my dad, had passed away unexpectedly. And it obviously was a very life-changing event for me. And I've always loved my dad so much and had a good relationship with him. And it's just not something that you ever expect to hear, especially before the time when you kind of expect that to happen. So I stopped recording, and I had to immediately make plans to travel from Missouri, where I'm at, to California with my 2 children, and I was almost 9 months pregnant. So we began all that preparation and lots of exciting curveballs on the way to California and back. But thankfully, we were able to go out there and be with my siblings and have a memorial for my dad. And then on the way back, I was 37 weeks pregnant and feeling very uncomfortable driving 1,700 miles home. And we got home at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and I fell asleep in my daughter's room. And 5 hours later, I woke up and I stood up, and immediately my water broke. And it just began the process of labor 5 hours after getting home. So praise Adonai, I was able to hold off the birth through all those long travels and wait till I got home so I could have my little girl at home like I had hoped with my midwife. But it was pretty hilarious that after all that travel and stress on the body, that I got those 5 core hours of sleep and then immediately went into labor. I had a really awesome labor and delivery. It was really quick, like my second daughter, Selah. Basically, from the time that I started getting contractions, about 2 to 3 hours later, I was pushing, baby out. So we were able to have her in the birth pool in our bedroom, again, like my previous child. So that was a blessing. But something else that happened that was life-changing and unexpected was as soon as she was born, we realized that she wasn't breathing properly, and it was all really a whirlwind. I remember kind of just flashes of those moments, and my wonderful midwife just seeing her face and realizing that something was off. After having 2 other children born, midwife home births, I kind of haven't had a expectation of what it should be like in it, and it was different. So after my midwife did everything she possibly could to try to, clear the lungs of my daughter and get her breathing properly, we realized that something more severe was going on. So we rushed her to the hospital, and it was determined within about an hour of testing that she had a birth defect called esophageal atresia, which means that sometime probably in the first trimester of birth, her esophagus did not fully form and not fully attach. So there was a gap in her esophagus, which meant that every time she tried to drink milk, that milk would pull up into a little sac, like halfway down her esophagus, and it would end up dumping into her lungs. And obviously her lungs would fill with fluid, and she would not be able to breathe, and none of that milk was getting to her stomach. So she had to obviously get hooked up to all these different types of machines in order to breathe and get food into her belly through her belly button. And on her 3rd day of life, she underwent a major surgery to attach her esophagus. And praise Yah, it went perfectly well, and she did so well. And after 11 long days in the NICU, we were able to take her home, and it was such a blessing. Her name is Yael, which has a lot of significance and meaning. I encourage you to look that name up. And Yael Genesis, Yael Jean for short, in tribute to my Nana, Barbara Jean. And so that kind of began another journey that was life-changing and different than I had ever experienced in my life. Although it was one of the most trying times for my little family to endure, it's amazing the shalom that Abba gave us throughout the whole experience, to the point that I literally had no fear the day of Yael's surgery and had full confidence in whatever outcome was meant to happen. That's a peace of mind that doesn't come from my own self-willing it to be so. And beyond that, we saw how Yael's condition was ultimately for the glory of Adonai. There were so many circumstances where she pulled through and healed so much better than expected. And even her demeanor and presence as a newborn was noted by all the nurses and doctors who worked with us. We had several nurses tell us that our room had a peace or like a vibe that was special and different than they had ever experienced, and that they looked forward to being with us. My husband and I took turns being with Yael while the others stayed home with our sister and 2 little girls. We never left her side. I had the head nurse tell me we should go home to maintain our mental health, in which I replied that being with Yael was ensuring just that. She looked at me for a moment and actually agreed that she would have done the same thing. She later told us that Yael had recovered from the surgery and was released from the hospital faster than any other baby with her same condition she had seen in 30 years. Again, all glory to the Most High. Just about a month after she was released from the hospital, I finally felt like we were getting into the groove of breastfeeding, and she was really getting used to being home and being with her sisters, and it was just such an amazing feeling. And one day I started noticing that within about 30 seconds of feeding, she started to choke. And after a few more seconds, she would choke a lot, to the point where she would start crying in pain. And I didn't know what was going on. It didn't happen every single time, and it was kind of like confusing, and I wasn't sure what the heck was going on. So 2 or 3 days later, I contacted her surgeon, who was so wonderful throughout the whole process, and let him know what was going on. And he said to bring her in for testing. So we brought her into his surgery clinic, and she did an esophagram in which they determined that she had a small hole located at the place where the esophagus had been attached during surgery. Now, ironically, this happened within like 2 days of a noticeable growth spurt that she had. And it was really interesting because my surgeon said in all the surgeries that he had done, because he specifies in this particular condition, that this had never happened. Once he had, surgically attached the esophagus, it wasn't going to be separating or coming apart. But in her condition, where the clip had been placed, that little bit of growth opened up just the smallest window, the smallest hole that allowed for a little bit of milk to trickle into her chest cavity and cause her to choke. So it was determined on that day that we would have to cease breastfeeding. She would have to get a nasal feeding tube inserted that would go obviously into her stomach, and I would have to pump and administer the breast milk through a syringe through her nose into her belly for 4 weeks while we waited for that hole to naturally seal back up. Now, this was a very challenging time again after thinking that all was well after the surgery and having been home for a month. I have to be honest that this experience was actually almost harder for me than the initial hospital experience, because I really thought we were past, some of these hurdles. But I had to really wrestle with my mind and my faith and realize that all of this was happening for a reason. It was all to strengthen her and to get her better and to work on myself as well. So we went through that whole process, and a month later we went back in, we did another test, and it was determined that the hole had indeed sealed up, but that she still had a issue with swallowing properly. Babies with this particular condition, they didn't have practice swallowing amniotic fluid in the womb during the time that they were growing. And actually, which I had no idea about, babies learn to swallow during that time in the womb. It's not something that they do for the first time when they drink their mommy's milk when they are born. So since she never got that opportunity, swallowing was kind of like a foreign thing for her. And I'd always noticed it was a little bit weird when I was breastfeeding her for that month, but she still did really good regardless. So what was happening is, because the coordination had not been there, not been practiced on during gestation, she was aspirating milk, meaning milk was going into her lungs, rather than her breathing tube, rather than properly going down the proper tube into her stomach. So a little bit was getting into her lungs each time, which, if that happens, obviously too many times over the course of, several feedings, a day or days, that could obviously be very damaging to the lungs and ultimately fatal if not addressed properly. So it was determined at that point that I would have to continue to pump and not breastfeed her directly, and I would need to thicken her milk with a special thickener that we get from the doctor. And that would, by having a thicker consistency, she was far less likely to aspirate, and it would make its way down the proper tube. So she is now 8 months old, and we still thicken her milk. We actually give her formula now as well, actually mainly formula, and that's a story for another time, but I make that formula from scratch. I use the Weston A. Price raw milk baby formula recipe. I highly recommend it. I'll be putting out a video regarding that recipe soon, and I think it's pretty life-changing, especially for families that want an alternative to store-bought formula but can't breastfeed for whatever reason. And I've always been a mom that I'm so passionate about breastfeeding, and I never thought I would ever do anything other than that. But again, Yael has kind of been my child that has made me do everything different. But she has taught me to be okay with having to do something different and be flexible and not, like realize that it's okay no matter what. Like, you have to find the best option even when what you perceive as the best option isn't an option, if that makes sense. Beyond all this, not being able to share this journey with my dad and just going through things that I never could have imagined that we would go through. I have a child that's alive. That's so beautiful. She's such a joy, such a sunshine to our lives. Seriously, like an amazing child. And I can't imagine my life without her. And it's just like nothing matters but being with her and her life. So I'm so thankful for going through this experience, and it's made her stronger, and it's made our whole family so strong. So I love her. Thank you for allowing me to share her story today and ultimately give glory to the Most High, because He either causes or allows. And I think everything's truly for a reason, to refine us like gold. And He wants to see how we handle things in certain situations, but He also wants to put us strategically in situations where the glory is able to be given to Him. And that often happens in hard times. So remember that when life doesn't go the way that we think that it's going to go, remember that there's always good to be had from it. There's always a reason why you're going through it, and ultimately it's to strengthen you and make you better, even if it seems to be dark and a situation that is hopeless. I think it's important to recognize that although we don't understand what's going on at the time, that ultimately the creator of the universe has a larger plan in place that we're all players in.